Chapter 5 Columbus in Chains. Outside, as usual, the sun shone, the trade winds blew. On her way to put some starch clothes on the line, my mother shooed some hens out of her garden. Miss Dewberry baked the buns, some of which my mother would buy for my father and me to eat with our afternoon tea. Miss Henry brought the milk, a glass of which I would drink with my lunch, and another glass of which I would drink with the bun from Miss Dewberry. My mother prepared our lunch. My father noted some perfectly idiotic thing in his partner house building Mr. O.T. had done, so that over lunch he and my mother could have a good laugh. The Anglican church bells struck 11 o'clock, 1 hour to go before lunch. I was then sitting at my desk in my classroom. We were having a history lesson, the last lesson of the morning. For taking first place over all the other girls, I had been given a prize, a copy of a book called Roman Britain, and I was made prefect of my class. What a mistake the prefect part had been, for I was among the worst behaved in my class and did not at all believe in setting myself up as a good example, the way a prefect was supposed to do. Now I had to sit in the prefect's seat, the first seat in the front row, the seat from which I could stand up and survey quite easily my classmates. From where I sat, I could see out the window. Sometimes, when I looked out, I could see the sexton going over to the minister's house. The sexton's daughter, Hillarine, a disgusting model of good behavior and keen attention to scholarship, sat next to me. Since she took second place, the minister's daughter, Ruth, sat in the last row, the row reserved for all the dunce girls. Hillarine, of course, I could not stand. A girl that good would never do for me. I would probably not have cared so much for first place if I could be sure it would not go to her. Ruth I liked because she was such a dunce and came from England and had yellow hair. When I first met her, I used to walk her home and sing bad songs to her just to see her turn pink, as if I had spilled hot water all over her. Our books, A History of the West Indies, were open in front of us. Our day had begun with morning prayers, then a geometry lesson, then it was over to the science building for a lesson in introductory physics, not a subject we cared for much, taught by the most dingy-toothed Mr. Slacks, a teacher from Canada, then precious recess, and now this, our history lesson. Recess had the usual drama. This time, I coaxed Gwen out of her disappointment at not being allowed to join the junior choir. Her father, how many times had I wished he would become a leper and so be banished to a leper colony for the rest of my long and happy life with Gwen, had forbidden it, giving as his reason that she lived too far from church, where choir rehearsals were conducted, and that it would be dangerous for her, a young girl, to walk home alone at night in the dark. Of course, all the streets had lamplight, but it was useless to point that out to him. Oh, how it would have pleased us to press and rub our knees together as we sat in our pew while pretending to pay close attention to Mr. Simmons, our choir master, as he waved his baton up and down and across, and how it would have pleased us even more to walk home together, alone in the early dusk. The way Gwen had phrased it, a ready phrase always on her tongue, stopping, if there was a full moon, to lie down in a pasture and expose our bosoms in the moonlight. We had heard that full moonlight would make our breasts grow to a size we would like. Poor Gwen. When I first heard from her that she was one of 10 children, right on the spot I told her that I would love only her, since her mother already had so many other people to love. Our teacher, Miss Edward, paced up and down in front of the class in her usual way. In front of her desk stood a small table, and on it stood the dunce cap. The dunce cap was in the shape of a coronet, with an adjustable opening in the back so that it could fit any head. It was made of cardboard with a shiny gold paper covering and the word dunce in shiny red paper on the front. When the sun shone on it, the dunce cap was all a glitter, almost as if you were being tricked into thinking it a desirable thing to wear. As Miss Edward paced up and down, she would pass between us and the dunce cap like an eclipse. Each Friday morning we were given a small test to see how well we had learned the things taught to us all week. The girl who scored lowest was made to wear the dunce cap all day the following Monday. On many Mondays, Ruth wore it. Only, with her short yellow hair when the dunce cap was sitting on her head, she looked like a girl attending a birthday party in the schoolgirl's own annual. It was Miss Edwards' way to ask one of us a question, the answer to which she was sure the girl would not know, and then put the same question to another girl who she was sure would know the answer. The girl who did not answer correctly would then have to repeat the correct answer in the exact words of the other girl. Many times I had heard my exact words repeated over and over again, and I liked it, especially when the girl doing the repeating was one I cared about very much. Pointing a finger at Ruth, Miss Edward asked a question, the answer to which was, on the 3rd of November, 1493, a Sunday morning, Christopher Columbus discovered Dominica. Ruth, of course, did not know the answer, as she did not know the answer to many questions about the West Indies. I could hardly blame her. Ruth had come all the way from England. Perhaps she did not want to be in the West Indies at all. Perhaps she wanted to be in England, where no one would remind her constantly of the terrible things her ancestors had done. Perhaps she had felt even worse when her father was a missionary in Africa. I could see how Ruth felt from looking at her face. Her ancestors had been the masters, while ours had been the slaves. She had such a lot to be ashamed of, and by being with us every day, she was always being reminded. We could look everybody in the eye, for our ancestors had done nothing wrong except just sit somewhere defenseless. Of course, sometimes, what with our teachers and our books, it was hard for us to tell on which side we really now belonged, with the masters or the slaves. For it was all history, it was all in the past, and everybody behaved differently now. All of us celebrated Queen Victoria's birthday, even though she had been dead a long time. But we, the descendants of the slaves, knew quite well what had really happened, and I was sure that if the tables had been turned, we would have acted differently. I was sure that if our ancestors had gone from Africa to Europe and come upon the people living there, they would have taken a proper interest in the Europeans on first seeing them and said, "How nice," and then gone home to tell their friends about it. I was sitting at my desk having these thoughts to myself. I don't know how long it had been since I lost track of what was going on around me. I had not noticed that the girl who was asked the question after Ruth failed. A girl named Hyacinth had only got a part of the answer correct. I had not noticed that after these 2 attempts, Miss Edward had launched into a harangue about what a worthless bunch we were compared to girls of the past. In fact, I was no longer on the same chapter we were studying. I was way ahead at the end of the chapter about Columbus's 3rd voyage. In this chapter, there was a picture of Columbus that took up a whole page, and it was in color. One of only 5 color pictures in the book. In this picture, Columbus was seated in the bottom of a ship. He was wearing the usual 3/4 trousers and a shirt with enormous sleeves, both the trousers and shirt made of maroon-colored velvet. His hat, which was cocked up on one side of his head, had a gold feather in it, and his black shoes had huge gold buckles. His hands and feet were bound up in chains, and he was sitting there staring off into space, looking quite dejected and miserable. The picture had as a title, "Columbus in Chains," printed at the bottom of the page. What had happened was that the usually quarrelsome Columbus had got into a disagreement with people who were even more quarrelsome, and a man named Bobadilla, representing King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, had sent him back to Spain fettered in chains attached to the bottom of a ship. What just deserts, I thought, for I did not like Columbus. How I loved this picture, to see the usually triumphant Columbus brought so low, seated at the bottom of a boat, just watching things go by. Shortly after I first discovered it in my history book, I heard my mother read out loud to my father a letter she had received from her sister, who still lived with her mother and father in the very same Dominica, which is where my mother came from. Ma Chess was fine, wrote my aunt, but Pa Chess was not well. Pa Chess was having a bit of trouble with his limbs. He was not able to go about as he pleased. Often he had to depend on someone else to do one thing or another for him. My mother read the letter in quite a state, her voice rising to a higher pitch with Each sentence after she read the part about Pa Chess's stiff limbs, she turned to my father and laughed as she said, "So, the great man can no longer just get up and go. How I would love to see his face now." When I next saw the picture of Columbus sitting there all locked up in his chains, I wrote under it the words, "The great man can no longer just get up and go." I had written this out with my fountain pen and in old English lettering, a script I had recently mastered. As I sat there looking at the picture, I traced the words with my pen over and over so that the letters grew big and you could read what I had written from not very far away. I don't know how long it was before I heard that my name, Annie John, was being said by this bellowing dragon in the form of Miss Edward bearing down on me. I had never been a favorite of hers. Her favorite was Hillarine. It must have pained Miss Edward that I so often beat out Hillarine. Not that I liked Miss Edward and wanted her to like me back, but all my other teachers regarded me with such affection, would always tell my mother that I was the most charming student they had ever, beamed at me when they saw me coming, and were very sorry when they had to write some version of this on my report card. Annie is an unusually bright girl. She's well behaved in class, at least in the presence of her masters and mistresses, but behind their backs and outside the classroom, quite the opposite is true. When my mother read this or something like that, she would burst into tears. She had hoped to display with great flourish my report card to her friends, along with whatever prize I had won. Instead, the report card would have to take a place at the bottom of the old trunk in which she kept any important thing that had to do with me. I became not a favorite of Miss Edwards in the following way. Each Friday afternoon, the girls in the lower forms were given, instead of a last lesson period, an extra long recess. We were to use this in ladylike recreation, walks, chats about the novels and poems we were reading, showing each other the new embroidery stitches we had learned to master in home class, or something just as seemly. Instead, some of the girls would play a game of cricket or rounders or stones, but most of us would go to the far end of the school grounds and play band. In this game, of which teachers and parents disapproved and which was sometimes absolutely forbidden, we would place our arms around each other's waists or shoulders, forming lines of 10 girls or so, and then we would dance from one end of the school ground to the other. As we danced, we would sometimes chant these words, "Ti-la, la, come go, ti-la, come go." At other times, we would sing a popular calypso song, which usually had lots of unladylike words to it. Up and down the schoolyard, away from our teachers, we would dance and sing. At the end of recess, 45 minutes, we were missing ribbons and other ornaments from our hair. The pleats of our linen tunics became unset. The collars of our blouses were pulled out, and we were soaking wet all the way down to our bloomers. When the school bell rang, we would make a whooping sound as if in great panic, and then would throw ourselves on top of each other as we laughed and shrieked. We would then run back to our classes, where we prepared to file into the auditorium for evening prayers. After that, it was home for the weekend. How could we go straight home after all that excitement? No sooner were we on the street than we would form little groups, depending on the direction we were headed in. I was never keen on joining them on the way home because I was sure I would run into my mother. Instead, my friends and I would go to our usual place near the back of the churchyard and sit on the tombstones of people who had been buried there way before slavery was abolished in 1833. We would sit and sing bad songs, use forbidden words, and of course, show each other various parts of our bodies. While some of us watched, the others would walk up and down on the large tombstones, showing off their legs. It was immediately a popular idea. Everybody soon wanted to do it. It wasn't long before many girls, the ones whose mothers didn't pay strict attention to what they were doing, started to come to school on Fridays wearing not bloomers under their uniforms, but underpants trimmed with lace and satin frills. It also wasn't long before an end came to all of that. One Friday afternoon, Miss Edward, on her way home from school, took a shortcut through the churchyard. She must have heard the commotion we were making, because there she suddenly was, saying, "What is the meaning of this?" Just the very thing someone like her would say if she came unexpectedly on something like us. It was obvious that I was the ringleader. Oh, how I wished the ground would open up and take her in, but it did not. We all shamefacedly slunk home, I with Miss Edward at my side. Tears came to my mother's eyes when she heard what I had done. It was apparently such a bad thing that my mother couldn't bring herself to repeat my misdeed to my father in my presence. I got the usual punishment of dinner alone outside under the breadfruit tree. But added on to that, I was not allowed to go to the library on Saturday and on Sunday, after school Sunday and dinner, and I was not allowed to take a stroll in the botanic gardens where Gwen was waiting for me in the bamboo grove. That happened when I was in the first form. Now here Miss Edwards stood. Her whole face was on fire. Her eyes were bulging out of her head. I was sure that at any minute they would land at my feet and roll away. The small pimples on her face, already looking as if they were constantly irritated, now ballooned into huge, on the verge of exploding boils. Her head shook from side to side. Her strange bottom, which she carried high in the air, seemed to rise up so high that it almost touched the ceiling. Why did I not pay attention, she said. My impertinence was beyond endurance. She then found 100 words for the different forms of my impertinence took. On she went. I was just getting used to this amazing bellowing when suddenly she was speechless. In fact, everything stopped. Her eyes stopped, her bottom stopped, her pimples stopped. Yes, she had got close enough so that her eyes caught a glimpse of what I had done to my textbook. The glimpse soon led to closer inspection. It was bad enough that I had defaced my schoolbook by writing in it. That I should write under the picture of Columbus, the great man, etc., was just too much. I had gone too far this time, defaming one of the great men in history, Christopher Columbus, discoverer of the island that was my home. And now look at me. I was even hanging my head in remorse. Had my peers ever seen anyone so arrogant, so blasphemous? I was sent to the headmistress, Miss Moore. As punishment, I was removed from my position as prefect, and my place was taken by the odious Hilarion. As an added punishment, I was ordered to copy books 1 and 2 of Paradise Lost by John Milton, and to have it done a week from that day. I then couldn't wait to get home to lunch and the comfort of my mother's kisses and arms. I had nothing to worry about there yet. It would be a while before my mother and father heard of my bad deeds. What a terrible morning. Seeing my mother would be such a tonic, something to pick me up. When I got home, my mother kissed me absent-mindedly. My father had got home ahead of me, and they were already deep in conversation, my father regaling her with some unusually outlandish thing the oaf Mr. Odie had done. I washed my hands and took my place at the table. My mother brought me my lunch. I took one smell of it, and I could tell that it was the much-hated breadfruit. My mother said, "Not at all. It was a new kind of rice imported from Belgium, and not breadfruit, mashed and forced through a ricer, as I thought." She went back to talking to my father. My father could hardly get a few words out of his mouth before she was a jellyfish of laughter. I sat there putting my food in my mouth. I could not believe that she couldn't see how miserable I was, and so reach out a hand to comfort me and caress my cheek, the way she had usually did when she sensed that something was amiss with me. I could not believe how she laughed at everything he said, and how bitter it made me feel to see how much she liked him. I ate my meal. The more I ate of it, the more I was sure that it was breadfruit. When I finished, my mother got up to remove my plate. As she started out the door, I said, "Tell me, really, the name of the thing I just ate." My mother said, "You just ate some breadfruit. I made it look like rice so that you would eat it. It's very good for you, filled with lots of vitamins." As she said this, she laughed. She was standing half inside the door, half outside. Her body was in the shape of our house, but her head was in the sun. When she laughed, her mouth opened to show off big, shiny, sharp, white teeth. It was as if my mother had suddenly turned into a crocodile.